Immerse yourself in history for a good night's sleep. But first, a quick word. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Trust me, you won't have the energy later. Now close your eyes, the story begins. Conventional wisdom dictates that great nations are born from grand ideas, from an unyielding popular drive for unity and freedom. But the history of Rus, which we're about to unravel today, begins with a paradox that shatters this noble archetype. At the heart of this colossal future state, sprawling across 2 continents, lay not a national impulse or a spiritual quest, but a brazen and utterly cynical business venture. A project launched by a band of Scandinavian adventurers who saw in the scattered Slavic tribes not a people, but a raw resource, and in the great riverine route from the Varangians to the Greeks, not merely a trade artery, but a fount of colossal profit that needed to be seized at any cost. Let me be clear from the outset. This won't be a dry lecture listing rain dates and princely names you already memorized in school. Nor will it be another recounting of blood-soaked battles and dynastic shifts in the vein of a heroic epic. Instead, this is an epic drama about the birth of a civilization from primal chaos. It's the story of how the sheer will of a handful of individuals, their boundless ambition, and a calculation as cold as Scandinavian steel managed to stitch together the warring tribes' disparate fragments into the unified fabric of a powerful future state. We will trace this incredible journey from Prince Oleg, who laid the foundation, to Ivan the Terrible, who erected the edifice of autocracy upon it, staining its walls with blood. And what strikes me most here isn't the final outcome itself, nor the sheer scale of the future empire, nor its military might. Rather, it's the sheer audacity, the near madness of the original concept. The very idea of arriving on a foreign, vast and untamed land and not merely plundering it, as Vikings did everywhere else, but organizing it, subjugating trade flows, imposing one's own rules of engagement, and, in essence, founding a state as a private commercial enterprise, with themselves as the board of directors. This was the most ambitious and perilous startup in Eastern European history, where the stakes weren't just profit, but life itself, and the right to enter the annals of history. Therefore, I invite you to be more than just spectators of this grand saga. I invite you to join me as intellectual investigators who will attempt, alongside me, to expose the mechanics of this historical marvel. We will dismantle this machine of power, bolt by bolt, to grasp the logic behind its creator's most ingenious and most ruthless decisions. We'll peer under history's hood to discern not only the gleam of crowns and the clang of swords, but also the economic interests, psychological traumas, and propaganda techniques that propelled this colossal process. This narrative upends our conventional understanding of patriotism and nation-building. For the driving force here was not the call of the homeland, but the insatiable hunger for profit and power. The early Rurikids were less founding fathers in the modern sense and more ingenious managers and, dare I say, racketeers who managed to transform the protection racket of trade routes into state ideology. They grasped a simple truth. Controlling chaos was far more lucrative than merely participating in it. And this principle became the bedrock of everything. Our investigation will tackle key questions. How did a handful of outsiders manage to subjugate vast territories and compel dozens of tribes to pay tribute? Why did Moscow, a small and initially unremarkable town, become the center of unification rather than wealthy Novgorod or ancient Kiev? And how did an idea, born in the mind of a pragmatic Varangian, eventually transform into the concept of the Third Rome and the messianic mission of an entire people? The answers to these questions are hidden not in dry dates, but in human psychology, in economics, and in the unseen cultural codes that we will begin to crack today. To truly grasp the logic of those events, we must accomplish the nearly impossible: switch off our 21st century minds and plunge into the sensory world of late 9th century Eastern Europe. The first thing that would overwhelm you isn't sound, but its absence. a primal, viscous silence of the boundless forest pressing on your ears. And then that silence begins to be torn by sharp, distinct sounds. The methodical thud of an axe, the piercing squeal of an ungreased cartwheel, the crackle of deadwood under someone's feet. And the smells. The air here isn't just fresh. It's thick, heavy. It's permeated with the aroma of pine resin, damp leaves, wet earth, and the acrid smoke of birch logs, which has permeated the coarse wool clothing and hair of every person. Inside a smoke-filled hut, lit only by a smouldering sliver of wood, this bouquet is joined by the sour tang of fermenting rye dough, the smell of dried fish, and damp sheepskin. Now, let's step inside a fortified settlement, enclosed by a rough palisade. Here, the soundscape grows more complex. We hear not just speech, but a mixture of dozens of Slavic dialects, through which the clipped, guttural speech of the Scandinavians cuts through. A saw whines as it cuts through a log. The blacksmith's bellows drone laboriously, a hammer rings against the anvil, and a whetstone grinds steel from a battle axe. And once again, the smells. To the smoke and dampness, we add the sharp stench of manure from livestock kept just beyond the wall, the pungent odor of tar used to seal boat hulls, and the heavy scent of untanned hides. This is a world of 100% organic existence, where nothing goes to waste and where every sound and smell is a signal, vitally important information. To survive here, people's consciousness was hardwired with two completely different cultural codes, two distinct operating systems. The first was the code of the local Slavic population. Its core was the verve, the tribal community. An individual was inconceivable outside of their kin and their village. Their life was dictated by the agricultural cycle of slash-and-burn farming. Clear a section of forest, harvest crops for several years, and then, once the land was depleted, move to a new area. Their gods were the forces of nature. Perun the thunderer, Velis the protector of livestock. This worldview was deeply conservative, focused on survival and reproduction within their own territory. It did not anticipate expansion. And into this world, another firmware intrudes, the code of the Varangian retinue. This wasn't merely a band of warriors. It was a hyper-efficient social machine designed for war and plunder. Its fuel was booty and glory. The retinue was an artificial brotherhood, bound not by blood, but by an oath of loyalty to the chieftain, the konung. Loyalty here was measured not by lineage, but by the leader's fortune and generosity. His mission was to lead his people to where there was Byzantine silk, Arab silver dirhams, and Frankish swords. Their worldview was not tied to the land. Their territory was their longship and their sword. This was a program geared towards swift movement, seizure, and control. Now, we are ready to formulate a precise, confident analogy that will become the key to our entire investigation. The Rurikids state-building project was nothing less than the first transnational corporation in Eastern European history, built on the principles of armed racketeering. It was the boldest venture startup in history, where geography itself acted as the angel investor, providing a unique resource, a river system connecting the wealthiest markets of the then-known world. Let's break down this business model. The CEO of this corporation was the prince. The board of directors and security detail were his retinue. The primary asset they seized and monopolized was control over the Varangian to the Greeks logistics corridor, including its most vulnerable sections, the portages, where ships had to be dragged overland. The main products they exported to Byzantium and the East were soft gold, sable, marten, and beaver furs, and the most brutal yet highly liquid commodity, slaves. And the local tribes, the Drevlians, Radimics, Severians, were treated as subsidiary enterprises, obligated to pay annual dividends under an unnegotiable contract. This payment was called tribute, and the process of collecting it was known as polyudie. This was a months-long winter circuit of controlled territories, essentially legalized racketeering on a national scale, which formed the budget of this colossal corporation. In the late 9th century, the Varangian corporation in the north faced a classic growth challenge. Their business model, though ingenious, was inefficient. Novgorod and Ladoga were excellent staging grounds, but the main market, Byzantium, was far to the south. The journey was long, perilous, and most critically, not entirely under their control. The southern stretches of the Dnieper River and the trade routes to the Caspian Sea were controlled by a formidable competitor, the Khazar Khaganate, which also collected tribute from some Slavic tribes. And right in the middle of this grand route, at the most strategically advantageous point, stood wealthy and prosperous Kiev, governed by other Varangian leaders, Askold and Dir. This was a critical vulnerability in their logistics chain, a constant threat, and a missed profit opportunity. The catalyst for change wasn't some specific battle or grievance. It was a simple yet brilliant strategic insight, which most likely originated in the mind of the man who became the true driving force behind this history. His name was Oleg, known in Scandinavian sagas as Helgi, the seer. As regent for the young Igor, son of the legendary Rurik, he could have comfortably ruled in Novgorod, collecting tribute from the surrounding tribes. But Oleg thought in different terms. He understood that half measures and localized control were a dead end. For the corporation to become an empire, it needed to stop being merely a northern power. It needed to seize control of the entire transit system. And for that, Kiev had to be taken. Oleg's idea was revolutionary and incredibly bold for its time. He conceived not just a raid, but a full-fledged military operation for a hostile takeover. The plan was audacious and straightforward. Gather all available forces, move south, capturing key logistical hubs along the way, and deliver a decisive blow to the main competitor. This was no longer the tactic of a Viking raider, but the strategy of a state builder. He didn't just intend to devastate Kiev. He aimed to make it his new headquarters, to shift the center of power to where all financial and trade flows converged. This was a move that fundamentally altered the nature of their enterprise, from seasonal plunder to permanent control. In the year 882, Oleg put his plan into action. At the head of a large army, comprised of Varangians and allied Finno-Ugric and Slavic detachments, he descended the Dnieper. First, he easily took Smolensk and Lubeck, leaving garrisons there and securing his rear. Then he approached Kiev, and here he demonstrated not only strength, but also cunning, befitting a great strategist. According to the Chronicle, he concealed the main part of his army and, posing as a peaceful merchant, sailed up to the city. He lured Askold and Dir out for negotiations, and when they unsuspectingly came ashore, Oleg's warriors burst from ambush. This had the effect of a bombshell. For the Kievans, it was a shock. Their rulers, who had ensured their safety and prosperity, were treacherously murdered before their eyes. But Oleg acted swiftly, preventing panic from escalating into resistance. He immediately legitimized his takeover, presenting the astonished townspeople with the young Igor Rurikovich and declaring, "You are not princes and not of princely lineage, but I am of princely lineage, and this is the son of Rurik." It was a brilliant political maneuver. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a restorer of justice, the legitimate representative of the only true dynasty. And then he uttered a phrase that essentially became the declaration of a new state. "Let this be the mother of Rus's cities." From that moment began a feverish period of asset consolidation. First, Oleg dealt with the competitors. He levied tribute on the Drevlians and Severians, who had previously paid the Khazar Khaganate. The Chronicle preserves his words to them, full of business pragmatism. "I am an enemy to the Khazars, not to you. Pay them no more." He, in essence, bought them out, offering a new, more efficient protection. This was a direct blow to the Khazars' business and the beginning of a long struggle for control over the entire East Slavic world. For his contemporaries, Oleg's actions were unimaginable. No one expected such audacity, such strategic vision, and such political flexibility from a northern ruler. He didn't just capture a city. He united the two main centers of the Rus world, northern Novgorod and southern Kiev, into a single system. He locked down the trade route, transforming it into his monopolistic asset. The great river artery, which had previously been merely a path, now became the backbone of a nascent state. A venture startup had transformed into a fully fledged, vertically integrated empire. How did this seemingly primitive system manage to control gigantic, forested expanses and extract resources from them with an efficiency that many modern corporations would envy? The answer lies not only in the genius and will of its leaders. The answer lies in the very mechanics of power, in a perfectly tuned production cycle. And here, a central metaphor will help us. Oleg's state was not just a country, but a gigantic river pump. The rivers were its pipes, the retinue its pistons, and Kiev the main accumulation reservoir from which wealth was pumped further into the global market. This machine operated with the ruthless precision of a Swiss clock, obeying the annual cycle of nature. Let's disassemble this mechanism with an engineer's enthusiasm step by step to see it in action. Step 1. Preparation. Everything began in late autumn, in November, when the first ice seized the rivers and snow fell. For the farmer, this was a time of rest. For the prince and his retinue, it was the start of the most important working season. Kiev transformed into a buzzing hive, a base for preparing the grand expedition. Weapons were checked, harnesses mended, horseshoes forged for sleigh horses. Hundreds of warriors, the flower of Varangian and Slavic youth, prepared for a months-long campaign called Podil. This wasn't merely tax collection, it was an annual demonstration of force, a mobile government that embarked on a tour of its branches. Step 2. Movement. As soon as a solid sleigh path was established, this army of tribute collectors set out from Kiev. This was not a swift raid. It was a slow, methodical, and intimidating procession. A massive sleigh train, loaded with provisions and equipment, stretched through the snowy forests from one tribal center to another. The route was strictly defined and remained unchanged for years. First to the Drevlians, then to the Dregovici, Krivici, Radimici, and Severians. The movement of this caravan was itself an act of power. The rumble of runners, the neighing of hundreds of horses, the glint of weapons in the winter sun, all of this reminded the local chieftains who the true master was here. Step 3. The gathering and the judgment. The arrival of the prince and his retinue in the tribal center was the year's main event. The tribute collection process was strictly regulated. From each smoke, that is from every household, a specific amount of goods was levied, precious furs of marten, sable and fox, as well as honey, beeswax and enslaved people. But the prince was more than just a tribute collector. He was the supreme judge. In his presence, the most complex disputes were settled, criminals were punished, and overly proud local elders were subdued. Thus, the Podil, the tribute-gathering circuit, served a dual function. It replenished the treasury while simultaneously affirming Kiev's supreme authority, preventing centrifugal forces from tearing apart the nascent state. Step 4. The logistics hub. Throughout the winter and early spring, the princely retinue remained on this circuit, collecting tribute and storing it in fortified outposts known as pogosts. Then, in April, as the rivers thawed from the ice, the return journey began. Boats, laden to the brim with this immense bounty of goods, flowed down the tributaries into the Dnieper River and converged on Kiev. For several weeks, the city transformed into a colossal logistics hub. Furs were sorted, beeswax was melted down into standardized discs, and everything was packed and loaded onto a new, much larger fleet, specially constructed during the winter for the year's most crucial voyage. Step 5. The export operation. In early summer, a magnificent flotilla departed from Kiev, sometimes comprising hundreds of single dugout boats known as monoxyla. This was the culmination of the entire annual cycle, a trading expedition to Constantinople, or Tsargrad, as it was known in Rus. This route was incredibly perilous. The primary obstacle lay in the Dnieper rapids, rocky shoals that had to be overcome by dragging the boats ashore and portaging them. It was here, at rapids with evocative names like Don't Sleep, that the Rus people were ambushed by their fiercest enemies, the Pecheneg steppe nomads. Each such expedition was a high-stakes endeavor where both goods and lives could be lost. And finally, Step 6, Triumph and Reset. Those who managed to break through reached their destination. In Constantinople, the wealthiest city of the then-known world, they sold their forest goods. In return, they acquired what served as the currency of prestige and power in the north: Byzantine silk, known as pavoloki, precious vessels, weaponry, spices, and of course gold and silver coins. In autumn, they returned to Kiev, bringing with them not merely wealth, but the very fabric of power itself. This gold was used to pay the druzina, the princely guard, to give gifts to allies and for construction. And as soon as the first snow fell, the great river pump was reignited. It was a ruthless yet brilliantly engineered machine that transformed squirrel fur and wild honey into the bedrock of a future empire. We marvel at the genius of Oleg and the sheer scale of his river pump. But this elaborate machine did not operate on its own. Behind every successful expedition and every sack of silver lay the colossal labor and immense hardship of thousands of nameless individuals. Let's get right to a tangible fact, without any sugarcoating or pandering to the audience. An ordinary rank-and-file warrior from the Kiev prince's druzina would, in a single Polyudye season, travel on foot and by sleigh through snow-covered forests, a journey equivalent to traversing the contiguous United States from coast to coast and back again. All winter long, in biting cold, far from home, he lived in a state of constant combat readiness, sleeping huddled together by a campfire and subsisting primarily on dried meat and frozen fish. And all this for a share of the spoils that could ensure him a decent living for 1 year ahead, and for the glory that, in that world, was valued no less than silver. But great deeds are not accomplished by warriors alone. Behind the scenes of this grand historical spectacle stood unsung heroes, without whom the entire system would have crumbled in a single season. The first such hero was the anonymous master shipbuilder. We speak of flotillas comprising hundreds of boats, but who built them? Every year, while the druzina was on its Polyudye circuit, work hummed along the banks of the Dnieper near Kiev. Master shipbuilders oversaw crews of carpenters who felled colossal oak and linden trees in the forests, then meticulously hollowed out their trunks to form the single-piece hulls of the monoxyla. This was hellish work. To expand the sides, the hollowed hull was filled with water, and stones, heated to glowing red in bonfires, were dropped inside. The boiling water and steam made the wood pliable, allowing it to be stretched outwards with special braces. These masters were self-taught engineers whose knowledge and experience constituted a strategic resource. Without their boats, the river pump simply would not have functioned. The second key figure, never mentioned in textbooks, was the tolmak, or interpreter. Imagine the scenario: an elite, Varangian by origin, needing to negotiate with dozens of Slavic and Finno-Ugric tribes, each speaking its own dialect. And then, to conduct highly complex trade and diplomatic negotiations with the Greeks in Constantinople. A person fluent in multiple languages was more than just a translator. They were the interface through which communication occurred. They could prevent unnecessary bloodshed by precisely conveying the terms of an ultimatum, or, conversely, provoke it. They could haggle for a better price on furs, bringing the prince additional profit. Their weapon was not a spear, but words. And in that world, words were sometimes far more lethal and effective. It was such people, engineers, logisticians, negotiators, who formed the invisible framework that supported the entire might of the Rurikids. They didn't wear princely robes or feast alongside military commanders. But without their daily painstaking labor, the Druzina would have remained merely a well-armed gang, incapable of state-building. They were the cogs and gears of a great machine, and history has unjustly erased their names. Now, let's ground our story with a striking everyday detail that best reveals the values of that world. We often speak of honor, glory, valor, but all of this had its monetary equivalent. The laws of that time, later codified into the Russkaya Pravda, Russian justice, clearly defined the price of a life. The murder of a free person, be it a warrior or a merchant, was punishable by a fine, the vira. And here's a shocking fact. The amount of this vira was 40 grivnas. A grivna was not a coin. It was a unit of weight, a silver ingot weighing about 200 grams. That means the life of a free man was valued at 8 kilograms of pure silver. To grasp the scale, let's compare. A warhorse, the equivalent of a modern sports car and a crucial status symbol, cost 2 or 3 grivnas then. It turns out that the life of one skilled warrior or successful trader was worth as much as an entire herd of 15 to 20 elite horses. There was no cynicism in this. It was harsh pragmatism. Society thus assessed the economic damage from the loss of a valuable member. And this cold, calculated approach to life itself was the very fuel that powered the entire system. From the simple warrior risking his life in the snows to the prince weighing the fates of entire tribes. For decades, the colossal river pump operated without a hitch. The system, fine-tuned by Oleg the Seer, seemed perfect and self-sufficient. Every year, like the changing seasons, the great cycle of the Polyudye repeated, bringing furs, honey, and silver to Kiev. It seemed nothing could stop this machine, which methodically transformed the prince's will into jangling coins and rustling silks. But any system, even the most ideal, has a vulnerability. And that vulnerability is always the human factor. Greed, hubris, a miscalculation. And one day, in 945, the machine suffered a fatal malfunction that nearly destroyed the entire enterprise. The catalyst for this crisis was Oleg's successor, Prince Igor. He inherited the system, but perhaps not the wisdom and caution of its creator. The Druzina, like any power apparatus, constantly demanded a larger budget. Warriors wanted more rewards, more glory, more plunder. And the prince, whose power depended directly on the loyalty of his top managers, the voyevodas, military commanders, was forced to squeeze more and more from the controlled territories. He began to violate unwritten rules. The tribute, which had once been a clear and predictable tax, started to transform into an extortionate levy that could change at any moment at the whim of the ruler. Then came the moment when patience ran out. In 945, Igor, as usual, embarked on his Polyudye. He collected tribute from the Drevlian tribe, a wealthy but proud and freedom-loving community living in the forests west of Kiev. The job seemed done. The Druzina had received its share, the baggage train was loaded, and it was time to return. But on the way back, Igor was apparently overcome by greed. Or perhaps he was egged on by the most avaricious of his warriors. He made a fateful decision. Having sent the main part of his force and the baggage train back to Kiev, he, with a small retinue, returned to the Drevlians to demand tribute once more. This was the perfect storm. For the Drevlians, it was not merely financial extortion, it was a violation of the very order of their world, a public humiliation. They had fulfilled their obligations, paid their tax, and now the tax collector was returning, demanding more. Mal, the local Drevlian prince, convened a council of elders. Their decision was dictated not so much by emotion as by the cold, primal logic of survival. The chronicle preserves their words, which perfectly encapsulate the situation. If a wolf takes to the sheep, he will carry away the whole flock until he is killed. They understood that if they yielded now, the levies would never cease. And so, they made the only decision possible from their perspective, to eliminate the source of the problem. Igor's retinue was slaughtered, and the prince himself, according to legend, was subjected to a cruel and symbolic execution. He was tied to the tops of 2 bent birch trees, which were then released. And at this very moment, the very feature that was the system's greatest strength became its mortal weakness. What was this feature? The prince's personal involvement in governance. The fact that the ruler himself, the paramount figure of the state, annually toured his lands was an incredibly powerful demonstration of authority. It instilled fear and awe. It confirmed that power had a tangible, living, and formidable embodiment. But it also made him incredibly vulnerable. The head of a colossal corporation did not sit in an impregnable office fortress. He went into the field himself, risking everything. And when he crossed the line, the suppliers were able to strike not at a low-level manager, but directly at the CEO. The entire hierarchy of power, sustained by his authority and the fear he inspired, collapsed overnight. In Kiev, panic and bewilderment reigned. The state was decapitated. Igor's heir, his son Sviatoslav, was still a child. And the Drevlians, emboldened by their success, launched a counter-offensive. They didn't just refuse to pay tribute, they decided to dictate terms themselves. They sent envoys to Kiev with an audacious proposal that Igor's widow, Princess Olga, marry their Prince Mal. This was an attempt not merely to secede, but to execute a hostile takeover, to subjugate Kiev and seize control of the entire system. The entire structure, so painstakingly built by Rurik and Oleg, groaned at the seams, ready to crumble into dust. The future of Rus, this audacious geopolitical project, now depended on one person, a woman who had just lost her husband in a world ruled by men with swords. Unthinkable responsibility rested on her shoulders. But would she withstand it? Could this fragile, nascent statehood, built on the will of one strong leader, survive his cruel and humiliating end? Or was this entire grand design fated to vanish in the smoke above the Drevlian forest, remaining merely a vague memory in sagas? The story of Princess Olga's fourfold revenge, as described in the primary chronicle, is one of the most vivid and brutal episodes in early Rus's history. But here, our duty as intellectual investigators is to be honest and acknowledge this version of events is most likely a brilliant literary reconstruction, not a dry historical record. Historians suggest that such multi-layered narratives of cunning vengeance are a common folklore motif found in the tales of many peoples. It is highly probable that the monastic chronicler, working a century and a half after the events themselves, cast a real but far more prosaic punitive operation into the form of a captivating, didactic parable. A parable about how a wise ruler, much like the biblical Judith, saves her people using not only force, but also cunning intellect. But if we set aside the folklore and engage in cold economic analysis, we will see that this act was driven less by personal grief and more by the iron logic of business. Igor's murder was not just a personal insult to Olga, it was a default on a key contract. The Drevlians didn't just kill a tax collector, they eliminated the CEO and the primary guarantor of the entire system. This was a signal to all other branches, the Severians, the Radimics, the Krivichs. The center is weak, paying is no longer obligatory. Had Olga not responded, the entire vertically integrated Polyudia system, this great river pump, would have collapsed within 1 or 2 seasons. This was a threat of complete bankruptcy. Let's gauge the scale of this financial catastrophe. The tribute from the Drevlian tribe alone, by the most conservative estimates, constituted a significant portion of the Kievan state's annual budget. This amounted to hundreds, if not thousands, of valuable furs and dozens of puds, a unit of weight, of honey and beeswax. Losing this asset was painful. But far more terrifying was the prospect of a chain reaction where other tribes would also cease payment. Therefore, the punitive expedition against the Drevlians was not an act of revenge, but a costly yet necessary investment, an investment in fear. Olga spent resources in the present to guarantee an uninterrupted flow of income in the future. The lesson she taught was simple and clear to all. One might attempt to withhold payment, but the price for doing so would be immeasurably higher than the tribute itself. This is precisely why each of her actions was not merely an act of cruelty, but a meticulously orchestrated political spectacle brimming with hidden symbols. Act 1. The envoys who proposed marriage are buried alive along with their longboat. This isn't just murder, it's a ritual humiliation. They arrived by water to seize her land and power. Olga gives them both. The longboat becomes their coffin, and the land their grave. This sends a message to everyone else. Whoever encroaches on what is mine will receive precisely enough land to be buried in. Act 2. The most distinguished Drevlian nobles are burned alive in a bathhouse. In Slavic tradition, a bathhouse is a sacred place of purification, hospitality, and peace. To burn guests in a bathhouse is to demonstrably violate all conceivable laws of hospitality, to declare that for enemies there are no rules and no mercy. The third act, a funeral repast, a somber feast in memory of her murdered husband, which she orchestrates just outside the walls of Iskorostan, the Drevlian capital. She invites the Drevlians to share her sorrow, and once they, having drunk themselves into a stupor on mead, let down their guard, she commands her retinue to slaughter them. This is a chilling display of sheer cunning and ruthless dominance. She weaponizes their own ancestors' most sacred traditions against them. And finally, the devastating crescendo, the city's fiery demise, orchestrated by winged agents. From a military logistics standpoint, this is questionable, but from a propaganda perspective, it's nothing short of genius. Birds, those ancient intermediaries between heaven and earth when employed by Olga, transform her into an avatar of supreme, almost divine retribution, unleashed upon her foes from the very heavens. But wait, there's another theory, no less captivating. Olga's policies and methods bear an uncanny resemblance to the Byzantine school of statecraft. In Constantinople, a city already in close communication with Kiev, public, theatrical, and exquisitely cruel executions were the norm for quelling rebellions and intimidating adversaries. Perhaps the chronicler, having received a Greek education, deliberately stylized the narrative to mimic Byzantine chronicles, intending to portray the barbarian princess as a ruler no less shrewd or ruthless than the enlightened Basileis. And her grand finale, the renowned tax reform, when she established the uroki, precise tribute amounts, and the pogosti, fortified administrative centers for their collection, best illuminates her ultimate design. Terror was merely a tool. Her primary objective was the creation of an orderly, predictable, and efficient fiscal system. She dismantled the old system, based on unwritten agreements, to erect a new one upon its ruins, bureaucratic and ruthless, like the mechanism of a well-oiled clock. And now, having journeyed together along this path, from the audacious business plan of Scandinavian adventurers to the terrifying vengeance of Princess Olga, as we've meticulously dissected the mechanics of the river pump and witnessed how the system nearly perished due to plain human greed, all the disparate threads of the narrative begin to weave into a single, cohesive tapestry. The picture comes into sharp focus, and we draw tantalizingly close to unraveling the central phenomenon of our story. How, by what miracle, did this seemingly primitive construct, built upon violence and plunder, not only survive, but become the bedrock of one of the world's greatest civilizations? So, what's the secret? It's frustratingly simple, yet utterly brilliant. The Rurikid phenomenon isn't a tale of conquest. It's a saga of organization. Their genius wasn't in vanquishing everyone in battle. Many possessed that skill. Their uniqueness lay elsewhere. They were the first in this vast region to grasp that one could not merely plunder, but orchestrate plunder. They realized that chaos was not only a threat, but also a resource that could and should be structured, harnessed, and profitably exploited on a continuous, systemic basis. They weren't merely warriors, they were Eastern Europe's inaugural chaos managers. Let's pit them against their rivals. The Khazar Khaganate also levied tribute from the Slavs, but it was too distant. Its control was loose, almost nominal. The numerous Slavic tribes were strong and warlike, but their mindset was local, tied to their forest, their clan, their fields. They couldn't conceive of transit routes or international markets. The Varangians, however, brought with them a unique confluence of qualities. First, the Viking mentality, geared toward distant expeditions, high stakes, and rich spoils. Second, they were outsiders, devoid of kinship or cultural ties in the region, which unbound their hands and allowed them to act with extreme, unsentimental brutality. And third, they possessed experience, having observed the workings of other, more complex societies, and were able to adopt best practices. The crisis following Igor's death and Olga's response became the defining moment, the crucible of a monumental synthesis. Igor ruled in the old-school manner by the sheer force of might, like a gang leader who could arbitrarily change the rules at his whim. And this system proved fragile. But Olga, having endured such a catastrophe, came to a crucial realization. She understood that personal power and fear were an unstable foundation. What was needed was an impersonal, self-sustaining system. Her celebrated tax reform, the introduction of the uroki, precise tribute quotas, and pogosti, fortified administrative centers for collection, was far more than a mere administrative innovation. It was a revolutionary leap forward. She replaced the unpredictable extortion of the personal polyudia with an impersonal, predictable, and inescapable bureaucratic tax-collecting machine. From that moment on, the state ceased to be a prince's personal venture and began its transformation into a self-sustaining institution. So what did they ultimately forge? They cast a rigid grid of power and economy over the vast, amorphous, ethnically variegated territory of the East European plain. They cared nothing for the beliefs of the Drevlians, the language of the Krivicians, or the customs of the Finno-Ugric Meria. Only one thing mattered to them, that the mechanism functioned and generated revenue. They took as their foundation the only unifying feature of these lands, their intricate river network, and transformed it from a mere geographical feature into the load-bearing structure of their nascent state. They welded dozens of warring tribes into a single economic zone, subservient to one singular logic, that of the great route from the Varangians to the Greeks. And here we return to Oleg's genius. His master plan wasn't to destroy and subjugate, but to unite. He didn't merely plunder Novgorod and Kiev, he linked them into a single chain. He didn't engage in endless warfare with every single tribe. Instead, he offered them a new, more lucrative umbrella of protection against the Khazars, essentially executing the first geopolitical rebranding in Rus's history. He forged more than just an empire built on fear. He created a colossal logistical network that offered benefits to all its participants, provided, of course, that the lion's share of the profits flowed to the center. With this understanding, we can now appreciate the true magnitude of the grand design. This was no longer mere politics or warfare in their pure forms. It was a design of titanic, almost divine proportions, an act of creation comparable to geological processes. To take a primeval, churning cauldron made of dozens of peoples, forests, swamps, and rivers, and impose their will upon it, to etch lines of power across it, to conjure a new political reality out of thin air. They weren't merely building a state, they were terraforming society. They took a world where the primary unit was the clan, and the major event was the changing of the seasons, and transformed it into a world where the primary unit became the smoke, a household hearth now paying tribute, and the major event was the arrival of the princely retinue. Thus, the ultimate revelation of the old Rus's phenomenon is this. It's the story of how a business model, brilliant in its simplicity and brutality, designed to control a transcontinental trade artery, endured crises and reforms, evolving into a resilient state machine. The Rurikids had no intention of forging a nation for the Slavs. They wanted to build a fortune for themselves. Yet, in tackling this purely pragmatic task, they unwittingly laid the groundwork for a future empire and determined its developmental trajectory for 1,000 years to come. The great river pump, set in motion by Oleg the Seer, has long since rusted into oblivion, but its cascading effects resonate to this very day. The most significant and enduring legacy of this project was the creation of a geopolitical north-south axis. By tracing a line on the map from Ladoga to the Black Sea, the first Rurikids unwittingly determined the primary vector of development and the principal zone of conflict for their descendants for 1,000 years to come. All of Russia's subsequent history, right up to Catherine the Great, has been, in essence, a desperate and bloody struggle to reclaim and maintain control over that foundational axis. The struggle against the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and then the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth for Kiev, Smolensk, and Polotsk. This was a fight for the recovery of lost corporate assets in the West. And the wars with the Crimean Khanate and the Ottoman Empire were a battle for a southern port, for access to warm water ports, which was the ultimate terminus of the entire trade route. This geopolitical axis, etched by the keel of a Varangian longship, became the principal fault line and the dominant vector of expansion for all subsequent history. But this legacy isn't just about grand politics. It's woven into our everyday lives, and we tap into it without even realizing it. Take the common familiar word tovar, meaning goods or merchandise. We use it daily, buying things at the store. Yet this word isn't originally Slavic. It's a linguistic artifact, brought to Russes by those Scandinavian merchant warriors. It stems from an Old Norse word that meant goods or property. Just ponder that for a moment. One of the core concepts of our modern economy is a direct inheritance from that very Varangian business venture. Every time we say tovar, we are, in essence, uttering a word that echoed on the lips of Igor's retinue as they tallied their spoils after the Polyudye tribute collection. Or consider the structure of our ancient cities. Why does nearly every one of them feature a Kreml or detinets, a fortified citadel perched on a high riverbank with a posad, a trade and artisan district sprawling at its base? This isn't coincidence. It's a direct architectural reflection of the social model the Varangians introduced. The Kreml is the headquarters, the corporate office where the prince and his retinue live, the power block controlling everything around them. The posad, meanwhile, is the production site and warehouse where artisans and merchants live and work, creating and selling those very tovari. This two-tiered structure, power at the top, business at the bottom, proved so effective that it was replicated across Russes for centuries, becoming the archetype of the Russian city. And here we arrive at the central, most astonishing paradox of this legacy. Remember where it all began, with an utterly cynical, multinational commercial enterprise, completely indifferent to religion. The first Rurikids weren't interested in the ethnic background or beliefs of the subjugated tribes. Drevlian, Krivichian, Finn, Slav, what difference did it make, as long as you paid your tribute on time? Their retinue was international, and their gods were as pragmatic and warlike as they were. This was a system built on pure calculation, force, and profit. But over time, this initial idea wasn't merely distorted, it morphed into its complete opposite. To manage such a vast and diverse territory, raw power and singular economic interest proved insufficient. An idea was needed that would bind everyone together, not by fear, but by faith. And that idea became Orthodox Christianity. From the moment of Rus's baptism under Prince Vladimir, a grand transformation began. The cynical business project started to gain the flesh of a spiritual mission. The corporation needed a powerful HR brand, and it found one. The result was unthinkable. A state founded by foreign-born Scandinavians with the aim of controlling trade routes and the slave market, several centuries later began to position itself as Holy Rus. the last bastion of true Christian faith on earth, and its ruler as the protector of all Orthodox believers. Pragmatic calculation was supplanted by an idea of messianism, and the memory of the Scandinavian CEOs was carefully edited and woven into a myth of a God-chosen people and its pious rulers. Thus, a commercial startup transformed into a sacred empire. And this paradox, the birth of a sacred idea from a supremely materialistic endeavor, became, arguably, the most significant and influential legacy of that distant and brutal era. Today, we live in a world of global corporations whose influence sometimes surpasses that of entire nations. We see how tech giants create their ecosystems, their digital principalities, setting their own rules of the game and collecting tribute from us in the form of data, attention, and money. And looking at this, it's a little unsettling how precisely modern business strategy sometimes mirrors the harsh logic of the Rurikids. Doesn't the struggle for control over supply chains, markets, data flows, and the minds of consumers echo Prince Oleg's fight for control over the great river route? We witness today the emergence of new, vertically integrated empires that strive to control everything, from content production to its delivery to the end user. And we, much like those ancient Slavic tribes, often face a choice: which ecosystem to pledge our loyalty to, whose products to use, whose rules to play by. The external challenges have changed, but their essence remains the same: a struggle for resources, for control over transit, and for the minds of people. In this sense, the history of Rus is an eternally relevant case study on how large systems of control are born, develop, and ultimately perish. And if we were to extract one single, yet most crucial and non-trivial lesson from this centuries-long drama, it would sound like this: any system founded exclusively on force and economic calculation will sooner or later face an existential crisis and be forced either to collapse or to discover a higher meaning, an immaterial idea, for itself. The Rurikids' cynical business venture survived and blossomed into a civilization only when the logic of profit was superseded by the logic of mission. As long as they were merely a corporation, they remained vulnerable, like Prince Igor, torn apart for demanding double tribute. But once they became the bearers of a grand idea, orthodoxy and holy Rus, their state acquired an altogether different kind of resilience. This is a lesson that naked pragmatism and efficiency have their limits. A machine can operate flawlessly, but without a soul, without an overarching purpose that unites people on the level of shared values, not just mutual benefit, it is doomed to internal decay. The most enduring systems in human history are those that successfully made this leap, from mere resource management to the formation of a shared worldview. Conversely, as soon as a grand idea degenerates and becomes nothing more than a thinly veiled excuse for cynical plunder, the system begins to rot and disintegrate. This is precisely why the history of Old Rus is not just a narrative about the gathering of lands. It is an eternal parable about the dialectic between the material and the spiritual in the construction of any grand project, be it a state or a global corporation. It reminds us that beyond the quarterly reports, logistical schemes, and market capitalization, there always lies something greater: humanity's perpetual quest for meaning in its existence and the willingness to unite for ideas that seem more important than life itself. So what, ultimately, is primary? The economic foundation or the ideological superstructure? What is more crucial for the survival of a civilization? A perfectly operating river pump, or a unifying faith in a shared destiny? The history of the first Rus's princes offers no simple answer. It shows us that these are two sides of the same coin, incapable of existing without each other. And this, perhaps, is the most vital lesson for us, inhabitants of the 21st century, who tirelessly seek to strike a balance between pragmatism and ideals in shaping our common future. Up until now, we've viewed this history through the eyes of the victors, the Varangian princes and their chroniclers. We've seen the Slavic tribes as mere resources, passive subsidiaries in their sprawling corporate empire. But now, I invite you to perform the most crucial intellectual somersault. Flip the script and view events from a different angle. Let's shed the cartoonish image of forest savages and recognize them as representatives of a complex, self-sufficient, and ancient civilization, with their own truths and their own ironclad logic. Because for the Drevlians, Severians, or Viaticians, their world wasn't a chaos waiting to be organized. It was already meticulously structured, just under an entirely different set of rules. Imagine the world of a Drevlian elder. His universe was as ordered and predictable as the turning of the seasons. At its heart lay his clan, his village, his sacred oak grove. His true wealth wasn't silver in chests, but the harvest in his granaries, the size of his livestock herds, and the number of sons strong enough to wield an axe and a spear. His life was bound by the age-old cycle of farming, hunting, and rituals, all ensuring harmony with nature and the favor of the gods. This was a civilization of the forest, deeply rooted in its land, stable and conservative. Their strength lay in their rootedness, in their intimate knowledge of every stream and every trail within their forest. Then, into this understandable, ordered world, something utterly alien intrudes. Imagine the sheer cultural shock they experienced with the arrival of the Varangian retinue. These were people who neither tilled the land nor raised livestock. They didn't dwell in one place. They swept in along the rivers like a flood and vanished just as abruptly. They spoke a foreign tongue, worshipped strange, cruel gods of war, and were consumed by an odd obsession with gleaming metals and vibrant fabrics. In the eyes of a Drevlian, the Rus were not builders of order, but its unravelers. They were civilized racketeers, nomads of the rivers whose existence hinged not on creation, but on the violent redistribution of others' labor. They struck them as a wild, unpredictable, and utterly foreign force, like a plague of locusts or a raging wildfire. Now, peering from this vantage point, let's re-evaluate the assassination of Prince Igor. In the official Kievan narrative, it was a treacherous rebellion by greedy barbarians. But from the Drevlians' perspective, it was an act of desperate self-preservation, logical and unequivocally correct. Their famous saying, "If a wolf becomes accustomed to sheep, it will carry off the entire flock," wasn't merely a metaphor. It was a precise diagnosis of their situation. They understood they were dealing with a predator whose appetite knew no bounds. The first polyudia was an understandable, albeit harsh, contract. But the second, unexpected demand for tribute shattered all unwritten laws. This was a clear signal that the rules could change at any moment. For the Drevlians, it meant their world, their stability, their very existence was imperiled. In their logic, Igor's killing wasn't a crime, but a surgical operation to remove a cancerous tumor threatening to consume the entire organism. But the Slavic tribes weren't the only ones to confront this new, aggressive force. To the south and east, the Rurikids faced a far more formidable and sophisticated adversary, the Khazar Khaganate. While we often perceive it as a declining empire in the 9th and 10th centuries, it was an immensely powerful state. It was a multi-ethnic and multi-confessional trading empire where Jews, Muslims, Christians, and pagans coexisted peacefully. The Khazars controlled vast stretches of the Silk Road and the Volga trade routes. They boasted prosperous cities, like their capital Itil, a highly developed bureaucracy, a strong army, and sophisticated diplomacy. They were a regional hegemon that had successfully stemmed the tide of Arab and nomadic incursions for centuries. So, why did this colossal power collapse under the blows of relatively small Rus' detachments? Herein lies the tragedy of predictability. Khazaria's strength lay in its order, its stability, its mastery of constructing intricate systems of trade duties and alliances. They were accustomed to a specific rulebook: warfare for control of trade routes, diplomacy for advantageous treaties. The Rus, however, brought with them an entirely new, viral business model. They didn't merely want a slice of the trade pie, they wanted the entire pie. Their goal wasn't to merely levy tribute on a competitor, but to utterly destroy them, burn their cities to the ground, like Itil, and physically eliminate them from the market. The Khazars excelled in a positional, predictable struggle for control. The Rus, in contrast, operated like saboteurs, delivering precise yet lethal strikes at the system's vital nodes. For both the Drevlians and the Khazars, the tragedy lay in one fundamental flaw. They attempted to comprehend a new, utterly irrational force from their perspective, using their old, rational logic. The Drevlians believed that by eliminating one wolf, they would solve the problem, failing to grasp that an entire pack, led by an even more terrifying she-wolf, would take its place. The Khazars thought they were dealing with just another group of raiders, not realizing this was a systemic project for a complete market overhaul. Their strengths, tradition, order, and an unwavering belief in immutable rules became their greatest weaknesses when confronted by a force that acknowledged no rules beyond the right of the powerful. Great endeavors demand great sacrifices, and geniuses often pay for their insights not only with their own blood, but with that of others. We've admired Olga, who saved the state, but her son and heir, Sviatoslav, represents a far more somber and complex figure. He was the culmination of a predator's evolution, a human weapon honed to perfection. Yet, beneath his brilliant victories, lies a tale of moral compromises that nearly cost Russes everything. And the most chilling of these wasn't the slaying of an enemy, but the betrayal of his own home. In the year 968, after crushing the Bulgars and seizing the richest lands along the Danube, Sviatoslav made a decision that shocked his contemporaries. He resolved to relocate his capital from Kiev to the Bulgarian city of Pereyaslavetz. This was more than just a move. It was an act of severance. He abandoned his aging, ailing mother Olga, his young sons, and Kiev itself, the very heart of the Rus lands which his ancestors had struggled so hard to conquer, for a dazzling new dream in a foreign land. The consequences of this decision were swift and brutal. As soon as he departed, the Pechenegs descended upon a decapitated Kiev, and the city narrowly escaped falling. To grasp the depth of this drama, one must peer into Sviatoslav's very soul. What was his inner world like? He wasn't a villain or a traitor in the classic sense. He was a man consumed by a single, all-encompassing idea. The chronicle preserves his astounding words, spoken to his mother and boyars. "I do not love to sit in Kiev. I want to live in Pereyaslavetz on the Danube, for there is the center of my land. All good things flow there, from Greece, gold, silks, wines, various fruits, from Bohemia and Hungary, silver and horses, from Rus, furs and wax, honey and slaves." These are not merely words, they are his manifesto, his economic and geopolitical doctrine. He looked at the map and saw that Kiev, despite its importance, was a forested backwater, a periphery. The true center of the world, the nexus of all trade routes, the focal point of wealth and power, that was there, on the Danube, on the border with Byzantium. The burden of power and responsibility weighed on him, but not in the way it did on other rulers. It wasn't war that oppressed him, but peace. He was not stifled by danger, but by the routine of state administration which his mother so cherished. He was a genius of movement, a genius of expansion. To sit in Kiev, resolve boyar squabbles, dispense justice, all of this was torture for him, a prison. His spirit demanded open spaces, new horizons, new enemies, and new spoils. This was his personal tragedy and the dark side of his genius. He was the perfect instrument for expanding an empire, but utterly unsuited to be its custodian. Power did not transform him into a tyrant. It merely amplified his innate nature as a nomad and conqueror to the extreme, causing him to neglect the most crucial thing, the security of his own home. He was solitary in his grand design. His retinue adored him for his simplicity, for sleeping on the bare ground with a saddle for a pillow, and eating meat roasted over coals alongside common warriors. They followed him to the ends of the earth for plunder and glory. But did any of them truly grasp the immense scale of his plan? Did any of them comprehend that he didn't merely want to plunder Bulgaria, but to build a new Rus there, a new empire that would dictate its will even to Byzantium itself? Likely not. He was surrounded by thousands of loyal men, yet at the apex of his ambition, he was utterly alone. And on the altar of this solitary, monumental success, the greatest sacrifice was made. His mother, Princess Olga. He didn't execute her or betray her in battle. What he sacrificed was not her life, but the work of her entire life. All her energy after Igor's death had been dedicated to creating order out of chaos and vengeance. She established taxes, built an administrative system, and embraced Christianity, attempting to civilize a wild land. She was building a fortress state, stable and orderly. And her own son arrived and, in essence, declared, "Your fortress is a dull village. My home is the whole world." His abandonment of Kiev wasn't merely a strategic decision, it was a symbolic assassination of his mother's legacy. This drama reached its peak when the Kievans, besieged by the Pechenegs, sent a messenger to Sviatoslav with a reproach brimming with bitterness. "You, Prince, seek foreign lands and care for them, but have abandoned your own. And we were almost captured by the Pechenegs, and your mother and your children. If you do not come and defend us, they will indeed take us." He returned. As if reluctantly, tearing himself away from important affairs, he crushed the Pechenegs, saving his family and the city. But as soon as the danger passed, he again declared that he was leaving for the Danube. He saved them physically, but betrayed them morally. The cost of his genius proved exorbitantly high. In his quest to conquer a new homeland, he nearly lost his old one. His insatiable energy, which allowed him to decimate Khazaria, became the very force that ultimately destroyed him. He would perish at the Dnieper rapids, returning from his disastrous Bulgarian campaign, slain by those same Pechenegs. His skull, legend has it, would become a drinking cup for their Khan. The circle was complete. A genius of conquest, who neglected the security of his own borders, fell victim to his own boundless ambition. When two tectonic plates collide, it doesn't lead to their smooth merging. It triggers earthquakes, fissures, volcanic eruptions. Similarly, when the new Varangian Byzantine model of statehood crashed upon the ancient world of Slavic paganism, it was not a peaceful synthesis, but a harsh, painful conflict. Imagine the shock of a 10th century Kievan resident. For centuries, he lived in a world of timber log houses that comfortably melded with the landscape and eventually returned to dust. And suddenly, in the middle of his city, like an alien spaceship, something unimaginable began to rise. The Church of the Tithes. It was built of stone and brick. It soared heavenward. It was massive, cold, and eternal. This was not merely a temple. It was an architectural manifesto, a physical embodiment of a new order, monolithic, hierarchical, and alien to the very organic nature of this forest world. This battle was primarily for the human soul. The world of the Slav was densely populated. In every stream lived a mermaid, in every forest, a forest spirit in every home behind the stove, a house spirit. It was a world one could negotiate with by offering a sacrifice, by whispering a charm. And now, into this cozy, lived-in world, a new faith intrudes. A faith in a single, invisible, omnipotent, and very demanding God. A God who does not dwell in a grove or a river, but resides somewhere in the heavens and communicates with people through a book written in an incomprehensible language and through his priests in strange robes. For many, this was akin to being told today that all laws of physics have been abolished and new ones introduced. The resistance was desperate. People hid idols, secretly performed old rites, and Christian missionaries were sometimes met with axes. This was not a change of religion, but a clash of two different cosmologies. But from this fierce collision began to emerge the most astonishing and peculiar hybrids. The ancient gods did not die. They acted more cunningly. They mimicked, donning the masks of Christian saints to survive in the popular consciousness. Thus, a unique phenomenon was born: Russian double faith, or dvoevery. The fearsome thunder god Perun, whose idol was cast into the Dnieper, did not vanish. He simply relocated into the image of Saint Elijah the prophet, who also rides across the sky in a fiery chariot and hurls lightning bolts. Veles, the horned patron of livestock and wealth, yielded his place to St. Blasius, to whom peasants prayed for the health of their cows. The pagan summer solstice festival transformed into Ivan Kupala Day, where ritual jumps over bonfires and wreath divinations peacefully coexisted with a Christian name. This was not synthesis. This was cultural guerrilla warfare, a partisan struggle in which ancient beliefs went underground, disguised themselves, and continued to live, creating a completely new, hybrid spiritual reality. This hybridization permeated everything. Take icon painting. The technique, the canon, the subjects all arrived from Byzantium. But look at the stern, ascetic faces of the saints in Novgorodian icons. There's none of the Byzantine refinement or Hellenistic harmony in them. Instead, they possess that primal, almost pagan power stemming from the depths of a forest-dwelling, pre-Christian Rus. Local masters, while adopting Byzantine forms, unconsciously imbued them with their own, utterly different content. The same phenomenon occurred with language. A new, sacred language, Old Church Slavonic, was layered over the vibrant spoken essence of Slavic dialects. From this fusion, the Russian literary language was born, where the elevated and bookish constantly coexist with the earthy and vernacular. And how did all this transform the life of the common person, who suddenly found themselves at this civilizational fault line? Their life was turned upside down. Previously, their time flowed with the sun and the seasons. Now, their year was delineated by a new ecclesiastical calendar with its fasts and feast days. Fasting wasn't just a diet. It was a new form of physical and spiritual discipline that altered the very diet and rhythm of life for weeks and months. The old morality, based on custom and blood vengeance, was replaced by a new one, with concepts of sin, repentance, and posthumous retribution. Even their names changed. Instead of the familiar-sounding Sviatozars, Gostomizls, and Liubavas, biblical Ivans, Peters, and Marias appeared, which at first sounded as alien as the names of characters from Norse sagas do to us today. Ultimately, this great melting pot did not annihilate one culture in favor of another. It gave birth to something entirely new and paradoxical. It created a centaur civilization in which a Byzantine head, with its imperial idea, complex theology, and yearning for order, was grafted onto a powerful, archaic Slavic body, with its pagan vitality, attachment to the land, and elemental anarchy. And this inherent duality, this eternal conflict and synthesis between the imported and the indigenous, between the state and the people, became the primary genetic code of Russian culture for all subsequent centuries. One might be inclined to believe that information warfare is a 20th century invention, born from radio, television, and the internet. But such a notion is a dangerous fallacy. In a world devoid of newspapers, where literacy was a rare privilege, rumors, symbols, and oral narratives wielded colossal, almost magical power. The battle for hearts and minds was no less crucial than the skirmish on the battlefield. And the earliest Russian princes, veritable maestros of power, intuitively grasped this truth. They were not merely warriors and administrators. They were the first political strategists, meticulously crafting their public image to legitimize their rule. The most striking illustration is Prince Vladimir's personal rebranding. Chronicles, penned in the Christian era, don't just reveal his past, they positively revel in it. They paint a portrait of a ruthless pagan, a fratricide, and, as we might now say, a sex addict with hundreds of concubines. Why? It was a stroke of genius, a masterstroke in myth-making focused on transformation. The blacker the darkness, the brighter the light. And so, at the zenith of his pagan fervor, Vladimir embraced baptism. The chronicles recount the legend of how he was struck blind before the ritual and miraculously regained his sight in the baptismal font. This wasn't just a story, it was a dazzling propaganda coup. Blindness symbolized spiritual error. Regaining sight symbolized the embrace of true faith. Before everyone's eyes, he transmuted from a bloodthirsty barbarian into a saint, into Vladimir the Red Sun, a wise and benevolent ruler. This meticulously constructed myth addressed several objectives simultaneously. It absolved his past sins, sacralized his authority, and reframed his choice of a new faith not as political calculation, but as a divine miracle. Naturally, this propaganda had its flip side. Foes and rivals didn't sleep. They spun their own counter-myths, their own smear campaigns. As Moscow began to assert its dominance, its principal rivals, Tver and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, launched their own information campaigns. In their version of history, the Muscovite princes were not wise gatherers of Russian lands, but rather cunning and unscrupulous upstarts. Their core argument was this: Muscovite rulers, starting with Ivan Kalita, were not champions of independence, but loyal lackeys of the Golden Horde Khans. They didn't earn power by right. They bought it by kowtowing to the invaders and brutally suppressing their own compatriots, as demonstrated during the anti-Horde uprising in Tver. This myth, portraying Moscow as a despotic Asian power, alien to true European and Kievan traditions, proved incredibly resilient. For centuries, it fueled the propaganda of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and its echoes still resonate in certain Western interpretations of Russian history. And here we arrive at the cardinal principle of information warfare. History is invariably penned by the victors. Let's take a concrete example to illustrate how the official narrative of an event can drastically diverge from what likely transpired. Consider the fall of the Novgorod Republic in 1478. According to official Muscovite chronicles, this wasn't a conquest, but a righteous act of reunification. The Novgorodian boyars, purportedly led by the heretic and Lithuanian mercenary Marfa Boretskaya, were allegedly planning to betray the Orthodox faith and surrender to Catholic Lithuania's dominion. Therefore, Ivan III's campaign was not an act of aggression, but a holy war, a rescue of lost souls from Latin heresy. This version transformed the brutal subjugation of an independent state into a pious endeavor. But if we examine this event from another perspective, drawing upon archaeological findings and logical inference, the picture shifts dramatically. For centuries, Novgorod pursued a pragmatic foreign policy, deftly navigating between its neighbors. Its attempt to forge an alliance with Lithuania was not religious treachery, but a desperate political maneuver, a last-ditch effort to preserve its independence in the face of burgeoning Muscovite tyranny. Marfa Boretskaya was no villainous heretic. She was a leader of the independence faction who ultimately lost. And heresy became merely a convenient pretext, a casus belli that allowed Ivan III to justify the conquest, confiscate the immense wealth of the Novgorodian boyars, and eradicate the very memory of republican liberties. The symbolic act that concluded this information war was the removal of the Veche bell from Novgorod to Moscow. This was no mere theft of a piece of metal. It was the ritualistic murder of a symbol. The bell had been the voice of Novgorodian liberty, its chime summoning citizens to the square to decide their own fate. By taking the bell, Ivan III didn't just seize the city. He silenced its voice, erased its agency, transforming it from a proud partner into a voiceless subordinate. The victor didn't just write his version of history, he physically obliterated the symbol of the alternative version, ensuring his narrative stood alone. If Igor's assassination and Olga's reforms marked the first point of no return, when spontaneous racketeering morphed into a systematic state, then 6 centuries later, the machinery of Russian statehood passed through a second, far more terrifying bifurcation point. By the mid-16th century, during the reign of Ivan the Terrible, the idea that had originated in the minds of the Varangians reached its zenith. It had mutated, strengthened, and acquired sacred significance. This was no longer just about controlling trade routes. It was a grand mission, the gathering of all Russian lands under the hand of an Orthodox Tsar, the defense of the true faith, and the transformation of Moscow into the Third Rome, the last bastion of Christianity. The early years of Ivan IV's rule seemed a triumph of this idea. Brilliant reforms were enacted. The Zemsky Sobor, Assembly of the Land, was convened, and the impregnable stronghold of the Islamic world, Kazan, was conquered. It seemed the state was operating more effectively than ever, fulfilling its grand destiny. But then, in the mid-1560s, something fractured. Critical tension accumulated within the system. The exhausting Livonian War for access to the Baltic Sea was not going as successfully as desired. The Tsar's beloved wife, Anastasia, died, and he was convinced she had been poisoned by the boyars. Trust in his inner circle, already undermined by childhood traumas, devolved into a total, all-consuming paranoia. The virus of suspicion had infected the very brain of the system, and the Tsar made a fatal decision that irreversibly warped the very essence of the grand design. In 1565, he announced the introduction of the oprichnina. This was not merely another consolidation of power, it was an act of state suicide. The Tsar divided the country and its administrative apparatus into 2 parts: the Zemshchina, which was to operate under the old laws, and the oprichnina, his personal domain, his personal army, his personal secret service, which was exempt from all laws except his will. From that moment, the machinery of autocracy slipped its brakes and began to devour itself. The end ceased to justify the means. The means, terror, violence, confiscations, became an end in themselves. Previously, the state battled external enemies, the Tatars, Lithuanians, Germans. Now, it declared war on itself. The primary enemy was designated not a foreigner, but one's own Russian boyar, priest or merchant, suspected of treason. The idea of gathering lands transformed into its opposite, the idea of their total cleansing and the redistribution of property in favor of a new oprichnik nobility. It was a theater of the absurd and bloody paranoia, where yesterday's hero and savior of the fatherland could today be accused of conspiracy and brutally executed in the marketplace. The grand mission devolved into a bloody farce. This tectonic shift led to a profound internal schism. The elite, who just yesterday had conquered Kazan and drafted laws alongside the Tsar, splintered into 3 factions: those who became executioners, those who became victims, and those who fled in terror. This conflict was perfectly embodied in the dispute between 2 former comrades, 2 friends, 2 heroes of the Kazan campaign. On one side stood Tsar Ivan himself, who embraced a new, pragmatic and terrifying reality where any means were justified to maintain power. On the other stood Prince Andrei Kurbsky, a talented military commander and thinker who remained loyal to the old ideals. He could not accept the new logic and, to save his life, fled to Lithuania, to the enemies. From there, across the border, he began to pen denunciatory letters to the Tsar. This is a dialogue unique in history, where 2 truths clashed with full force. Kurbsky, the idealist, accused Ivan, "Why, Tsar, have you slain the commanders given to you by God and spilled their victorious holy blood in God's churches? Why have you imagined an unheard-of heresy within yourself, as if you are above any law? You have replaced wise advisors with mad flatterers and hangers-on. And Ivan, the pragmatist, driven to a fever pitch by paranoia, retorted with the fury of an absolute monarch, "Who gave you the right to judge me, a God-given ruler? Am I not entitled to execute my servants if they commit treason? Your business is to obey, not to lecture me." This was not merely a dispute between two individuals. It was a dispute between two models of statehood, a state based on law and counsel with the elite, and a state based on the boundless, arbitrary will of a single man. The symbolic act that marked the ultimate betrayal of the idea was the Oprichnina pogrom of Novgorod in 1570. The Tsar suspected the ancient city of intending to side with Lithuania. What transpired next defies rational explanation. The Oprichnina army stormed one of the wealthiest and most important cities in Rus and unleashed a multi-week slaughter. Thousands of people were tortured and drowned in the icy waters of the Volkhov River. Not only the homes of boyars and merchants were plundered, but also churches and monasteries. This was not merely a punitive expedition, it was an act of ritualistic destruction. Ivan the Terrible wasn't just destroying mythical traitors, he was eradicating the very memory of an alternative path for Russia's development, the path of a mercantile republic, the path of veche liberties. He was branding with a hot iron any thought that there could exist any form of power other than his personal unlimited despotism. The consequences were catastrophic. The Oprichnina did not strengthen the state. It mortally wounded it. The most experienced military commanders were annihilated, and in the very next year, 1571, the Crimean Khan Devlet Giray easily reached Moscow and burned it to the ground. The Oprichnina army proved ineffectual. Entire regions were devastated, the economy collapsed, and peasants fled their ancestral homes en masse. The idea of the Third Rome was defiled by the blood of its own citizens. The grand vision for building a mighty Orthodox empire degenerated into a paranoid dictatorship that led the country to the time of troubles, a complete collapse of statehood. The second point of no return had been crossed. The system had utterly betrayed itself. When the smoke cleared from the fires and the Oprichnina terror, having exhausted itself, faded away, the country that had endured this shock was utterly transformed. This was not merely Russia, weakened by war and repression. It was a new society with a broken spine and a rewired consciousness. And the principal outcome of this bloody revolution from above was a complete change in elites. The old, aristocratic nobility, the princes and boyars, whose power rested on ancient lineage and the ownership of hereditary estates, vochina, was physically and morally annihilated. Their ancestral homes were ravaged, their names erased from records, their pride trampled in the mud of Moscow's execution blocks. This was the end of an entire civilization within the state, a civilization of aristocratic honor, complex clan ties, and a relative, albeit limited, independence from supreme authority. In their place rose a new ruling class. These were the fledglings of Ivan's nest, the oprichniks, the service gentry. People without lineage, without tribal ties, whose sole virtue and sole capital was personal, dog-like devotion to the sovereign. Their wealth was not a hereditary vochina, but an estate granted to them for temporary use in service, which the Tsar could revoke at any moment. This new elite was absolutely dependent on the central authority. They did not look to their peers as equals, but only upward, to the Tsar, the sole source of all blessings and all misfortunes. Thus was born a new social structure, not a network of aristocratic clans bound by intricate ties, but a rigid vertical hierarchy with an omnipotent master at the top and his rightless servants, the kolops, at the bottom. The economy of this new world was built, quite literally, on bones. The colossal resources confiscated from the old aristocracy weren't used for national development. Instead, they were instantly plundered and distributed among the Oprichnina horde as payment for their loyalty. The wealthiest and most economically developed lands in the country's heartland, around Novgorod and Tver, were utterly laid waste. This led to a monstrous economic and demographic crisis. Peasants, fleeing terror and exorbitant taxes, migrated en masse to the wild fringes, to the south and east. The central regions faced an acute labor shortage, and the state, to provide its new gentry landowners with manpower, found the only possible solution. It began to bind peasants to the land, prohibiting them from leaving their masters. Thus, the Oprichnina terror became a direct catalyst for the process of encirclement, which would define Russia's social and economic landscape for centuries. The map of the country also changed. Old centers of power and alternative thought, like Novgorod, were not merely defeated. They were psychologically broken, transformed into unremarkable provincial towns. All political, economic, and spiritual life now concentrated in one place, Moscow, which came to be perceived as the sole and uncontested center of authority. The trade routes that Ivan the Terrible had so desperately tried to forge to the Baltic Sea were completely sealed off as a result of the lost Livonian War. The country, in essence, found itself isolated, cut off from Europe and from the seas. The only vector for possible expansion remained the east, the Volga region, a path opened after the conquests of Kazan and Astrakhan. But the most profound changes occurred not in the economy, but within people's minds. A society that had experienced the Oprichnina was a society of profound trauma. The dominant emotion that settled in souls for decades was fear. But this wasn't the former, understandable fear of an external enemy, a Tatar or a Litvin. This was a new, sticky, irrational fear of one's own state, which at any moment could transform from protector into ruthless executioner. This fear shattered social bonds, fostering an atmosphere of pervasive snitching and suspicion. Neighbor ceased to trust neighbor, brother. Each individual found themselves alone, facing the unpredictable and terrifying will of the sovereign. This deep societal trauma birthed a paradoxical psychological coping mechanism. To survive and maintain their sanity, people had to unearth some higher meaning amidst the sanguinary chaos. And a meaning was indeed found. In the popular consciousness, the idea took root that the Tsar's power was a force of nature, akin to a thunderstorm or a flood. It could be terrifying, destructive even, yet it was from God, and mere mortals could not presume to judge it. The Tsar's wrath was no longer seen as tyranny, but as divine retribution for collective sins, a fiery crucible of purification to be humbly endured. Thus, amidst the agony of the Oprichnina, the archetype of the terrible but just Tsar was forged, along with the myth of the firm hand without which this immense nation would inevitably splinter. A society emerging from this upheaval was prepared to embrace autocracy not merely as a political system, but as the sole viable form of national existence. Behind every grand empire and every bloody revolution lies not only the might of arms, but also the potency of an idea. The brilliant victories and monstrous atrocities of Ivan the Terrible's era would have been impossible without a robust philosophical bedrock that justified, contextualized, and guided the Tsar's actions. And the central philosophical concept that governed everything became the doctrine of Moscow, the Third Rome. This idea, conceived during the reign of Ivan's grandfather, was not simply a beautiful metaphor. It was a full-fledged political theological theory that completely redefined the place and role of the Moscow state in world history. Its essence was as simple as it was monumental. The first Rome fell due to Catholic heresy. The second Rome, Constantinople, succumbed to Turkish onslaughts for entering into union with Catholics. And now, only one bastion of the true, uncorrupted Orthodox faith remained on the entire earth: Moscow. Two Romes have fallen, the third stands, and a fourth there shall never be. This concept transformed the Moscow sovereign from a simple national leader into something incomparably grander. He became more than just a Tsar. He was the ultimate defender of universal orthodoxy. His state was not merely a country, but a new Israel, a sacred ark destined to preserve the purity of faith until the second coming. Any action by the Tsar aimed at strengthening his power and expanding the state now received the highest sacred justification. The conquest of Kazan was transformed from a mere act of geopolitical expansion into a missionary feat, a beacon of true faith brought to the pagans. And the struggle against traitor boyars was reframed not as political repression, but as the purging of the sacred ark from impurities that threatened to capsize it. The idea of the Third Rome became a potent ideological weapon that legitimized the monarch's absolute power and elevated him to a figure of almost divine stature. But who was the intellectual architect, the grey eminence, who implanted this idea in the young Tsar's mind and helped him to internalize its profound implications? This person was Metropolitan Macarius of Moscow. An eminent church leader, a prolific scholar, and a master ideologist, Macarius was the chief architect of the entire ideology of autocracy. It was he who orchestrated the famous coronation ceremony of Ivan in 1547, endowing it with Byzantine grandeur and imbuing it with profound symbolic meaning. It was he who supervised the creation of monumental chronicle compilations and the Great Mannaian Reader, a colossal collection of saints' lives designed to prove that the Russian land was sacred and divinely chosen. Macarius was more than just a spiritual advisor. He was the era's leading political strategist who constructed an entire universe for the young Tsar, where everything attested to his exceptional nature and his divine right to unlimited power. He was the one who bestowed upon Ivan not only a crown, but the formidable ideology to secure that very crown. Yet, no grand idea exists in a vacuum. It invariably faces an opposing idea, an antagonist, and their struggle shapes the course of history. The alternative philosophical doctrine that challenged the concept of autocracy was that of an aristocratic, estate-based monarchy. Its proponents were the most educated representatives of the old, noble families, such as Prince Andrei Kurbsky. They were not against monarchy per se, but they believed that the Tsar should not rule alone, but in council with his synclitics, wise and eminent boyars. Their ideal was not a Byzantine despotism, but rather a European model, where the king's power was limited by the rights of the aristocracy and by assemblies of estates. They held that wisdom resided not in one person, but in the collective experience of the state's most capable individuals. Power, in their view, should rest not only on divine right, but also on law, tradition, and the consent of the elite. This dispute between two ideas, absolute, unfettered monarchy and an aristocratic monarchy limited by law and council, was far more than a mere philosophical discussion. It determined realpolitik and ignited a bloody conflict. The oprichnina was not simply the whim of a paranoid ruler. It was a radical, surgical operation designed to obliterate the very possibility of an alternative aristocratic model taking root. Ivan the Terrible physically exterminated the proponents of this idea because he understood that as long as they lived, as long as the very notion existed that power could be somehow limited and challenged, his autocracy would never be absolute. The correspondence between Ivan the Terrible and Kurbsky is not just an exchange of personal insults. It is the culmination of a monumental debate between two philosophical systems. Kurbsky appeals to reason, law, and tradition. Ivan appeals to divine will and his sacred right. Kurbsky sees the Tsar as first among equals. Ivan sees himself as God's anointed and everyone else as his serfs. And in this struggle, Ivan's idea triumphed. Not because it was more logical or humane, but because it was backed by the full might of the state apparatus of violence. The philosophy of autocracy was written not in ink on parchment, but in blood on the executioner's block. When Ivan the Terrible died in 1584, the system he had created seemed monolithic, like an Egyptian pyramid. Cruel, yes. Bloody, absolutely. But unshakable. The power vertical, built on fear and personal loyalty, permeated society from the highest boyar to the lowest serf. It seemed this machine would operate forever. But this was an illusion. This entire colossal structure rested not on law or institutions, but on one single element: the titanic, paranoid will of the Tsar himself. He was the super-powerful magnet that held all the iron filings of his empire together. And the moment his heart ceased, the magnetic field vanished. And the system, freed from the monstrous pressure, didn't just begin to crumble. It began to violently tear itself apart under the accumulated internal entropy. There was no external enemy. The system began to devour itself. The first casualty of this entropy was power itself. Ivan's son, Fyodor Ivanovich, a pious, quiet man, utterly incapable of governance, ascended the throne. He was a vacuum at the center of a system that demanded constant violence and control. And into this vacuum immediately rushed the ambitions of those who had survived the Oprichnina's meat grinder. Chief among them was Boris Godunov, a cunning, shrewd, and incredibly power-hungry boyar, brother of the new Tsar's wife. He was not a Rurikid, but he was a brilliant product of the era who understood one thing: the throne was no longer inherited. It was seized. He became the de facto ruler, pushing aside the old noble families. But this was just the beginning of the struggle for an inheritance that hadn't even been declared vacant yet. The linchpin that unleashed the avalanche was the mysterious death in Uglish in 1591 of the last direct heir, Tsarevich Dmitry. Was it an accident during a children's game with knives, as the official version claimed, or a cunning murder orchestrated by Godunov? The precise truth was irrelevant. What mattered was this: Dmitry's death severed the final tie connecting the throne to the 1,000-year-old Rurikid dynasty. The grand idea of the dynasty's divine chosenness, the very foundation of legitimate power, crumbled. And now, each of the would-be heirs began twisting it to serve their own ends. Boris Godunov, leveraging his influence, secured his election to the throne by the Zemsky Sobor. But for the old boyar families, the Shuisky and the Romanovs, he was no divine anointed one, but an upstart, a usurper. The grand idea of autocracy was torn to pieces. Godunov used it to justify his power, while the boyars used it to justify their opposition to him. And on this fertile ground of widespread mistrust and delegitimized authority, the most poisonous fruit of the time of troubles blossomed forth: imposture. The appearance of false Dmitry I was more than just an audacious gamble. It was a symptom of the system's complete disintegration. The common people, and even a segment of the boyars, believed him not because he resembled the Tsarevich, but because the very idea of a miraculously saved legitimate Tsar was a lifeline in an ocean of lawlessness. They yearned to believe. And this spectre, this political simulacrum, backed by Polish gold and sabers, easily seized Moscow. But upon becoming Tsar, he began to behave like a European monarch, breaking centuries-old Muscovite customs, which utterly fractured his supporters. The inheritors of the grand idea were not merely struggling for power, they were now fabricating imitations of it, wielding it as a mere tool to achieve their own ends. After false Dmitry's assassination in 1606, the country plunged into utter chaos. A representative of the old nobility, Vasily Shuisky, ascended the throne, but his power did not extend beyond the Kremlin's walls. Immediately, a new impostor appeared, false Dmitry II, who earned the moniker the Tushino Thief. The country cleaved in two. There were two Tsars, two capitals, Moscow and Tushino just outside the city, two Boyar Duma, even two patriarchs. Yesterday's serfs became military governors. Boyars defected from one camp to another. The state, as a cohesive organism, ceased to exist. It was a war of all against all, exacerbated by the invasion of foreign armies, the Poles and Swedes, who arrived no longer as allies of various factions, but as predators to dismember the dying body of Rus. And in this hell of anarchy, only one last shard of the old, unbetrayed idea remained. This was Patriarch Hermogenes. When the Moscow boyars, betraying everything imaginable, invited the Polish Prince Władysław to the Russian throne and allowed a Polish garrison into the Kremlin, Hermogenes was the last one to say no. He was the final torchbearer of the idea of an independent Orthodox Tsardom. Imprisoned by the Poles in the dungeon of the Chudov monastery, he refused to bless the new authority and dispatched letters across the land, calling for the defense of faith and fatherland. Neither threats nor hunger broke him. He died a martyr's death, starved to death in his cell, but his word ignited the flame of the popular militia led by Minin and Pozharsky. His death became the symbolic end of an entire epoch. The grand system created by the Rurikids finally perished, but its last shard, its moral core, provided the impetus for the birth of a new Russia. When the young Michael Romanov was elected to the throne in 1613, it was not a restoration. It was the creation of a new world from ashes. The gigantic, seemingly eternal system of autocracy, having completed a full cycle from its organization to self-destruction, proved that no power built solely on force and fear can ever be eternal. It inevitably breeds monsters that will, in the end, devour it. The era that began with a bold Varangian venture ended in total bankruptcy and bloody chaos, serving as an eternal lesson for all future empire builders. After the time of troubles had scorched the nation to its very foundations, the new Romanov dynasty needed not merely to rebuild the state, but to completely rewrite its historical narrative. The simplest way to legitimize their still fragile power was to transform the preceding era into a chilling cautionary tale, a grim lesson about what happens when the rightful dynasty is severed. For nearly 2 centuries, the grand and terrifying legacy of the last Rurikids was placed in suspended animation. The image of Ivan the Terrible was deliberately reduced to a caricature, a mad tyrant, a bloodthirsty monster whose sins had invited divine retribution upon Rus. His complex reforms, his geopolitical foresight, all the titanic work involved in forging the machinery of autocracy, all of this was buried beneath thick layers of official mythology. He was whispered about like a biblical pharaoh, but never truly studied. The era that spawned him became a dark, accursed age, from which they needed to isolate themselves with the piety and quietude of the new, most serene Tsars. Then, in the early 19th century, amidst the Enlightenment and Romanticism, an intellectual eruption occurred. Into the archives, covered in centuries of dust, stepped a man who would become a true archaeologist of Russian history, Nikolai Karamzin. Working on his monumental history of the Russian state, he essentially rediscovered Ivan the Terrible for educated society. He didn't merely rehash myths, he delved into primary sources, chronicles, charters, the Tsar's correspondence with Kurbsky. And from his pen arose not a one-dimensional villain, but a figure of Shakespearean magnitude, brilliant, educated, passionate, and at the same time monstrously cruel. For readers brought up on sentimental novels, this was a profound shock. The effect was comparable to a ghost of the first Tsar, flesh and blood, suddenly appearing in the middle of a St. Petersburg salon. Karamzin didn't just describe history. He resurrected a monster, and all of Russia, in a mix of horror and fascination, gazed into his burning eyes. This rediscovery splintered Russian society in two and ignited a centuries-long debate about the essence of Russia, a debate that remains unresolved to this very day. The intellectuals of that era, like predators, pounced upon the resurrected Tsar, and each began to sculpt an image of him that affirmed their own theories. Thus began the era of grand misinterpretation. For the Slavophiles, who sought a unique, distinctive path for Russia, Ivan the Terrible became a tragic national hero. He was their original champion of Russia's unique identity, who with an iron hand fought against the pro-Western, self-serving boyar aristocracy that sought to carve up the country. His cruelty was not madness, but a frightening yet necessary surgical intervention to save the national body. He was a formidable yet truly Russian Tsar, one of their own. For their opponents, the Westernizers, that same Ivan the Terrible became the primary evidence of Russia's perpetual backwardness and despotism. In him, they saw the very embodiment of a perceived Asianism, a Mongol legacy that poisoned Russian political culture for centuries. The Oprichnina, for them, was not a struggle for unity, but the annihilation of the last sprouts of freedom, epitomized by the devastated Novgorod. For the Westernizers, Ivan was not a hero, but an anti-hero, Russia's original sin, who diverted it from the common European path of development and condemned it to an endless cycle of tyranny and servitude. One and the same man became an icon for some and a devil for others. However, the most cynical and terrifying reimagining of Ivan the Terrible's legacy unfolded in the 20th century. When Joseph Stalin began his own Oprichnina-style purges, he needed historical justification, and he found it in the figure of the first Tsar. At Stalin's personal behest, director Sergei Eisenstein made the film Ivan the Terrible, which became a monumental act of historical rehabilitation and propaganda. In this version, Ivan is portrayed as a progressive and wise statesman, a genius forging a powerful, centralized state. His enemies, the boyars, are depicted as cunning reactionaries and traitors who hatch plots and impede the nation's progress. Here, the Oprichnina is not paranoid terror, but a necessary, just, and historically progressive measure to purge the state of its fifth column. The parallels with the 1930s were so glaringly obvious they required no commentary. History was not merely rewritten, it was mobilized and pressed into service for a totalitarian machine, transforming into a weapon to justify mass repressions. Thus, the long echo of the Rurikid era reverberated through the centuries. Their legacy proved too monumental to be simply forgotten. It morphed into an eternal mirror, into which each new generation gazed to understand itself. The figure of the first Tsar, the ultimate product of the entire system from Oleg to the Terrible, became more than just a historical character. It became a battlefield, a symbol upon which those who debate Russia's past, present and future still cross swords. Oblivion proved impossible. Instead, it gave way to an eternal, agonizing metamorphosis within the minds of its descendants. And now, having traversed this colossal journey spanning 7 centuries, we return to the beginning, as if on a spiral of time. Let us recall the very first paradox with which we began our inquiry. The history of Kievan Rus began as a daring, cynical, and utterly pragmatic business venture conceived by a group of foreign adventurers who saw in the vast land merely a resource for extracting profit. Their objective was not the people, but a trade route. Their ideology was not faith, but gain. But what do we witness at the close of this grand cycle in the era of the time of troubles? The country is saved not by pragmatism or calculation, but by something entirely antithetical. It is saved by the irrational, almost insane impulse of a simple Nizhny Novgorod merchant, Kuzma Minin, who sacrifices his entire fortune to raise a militia, and by Patriarch Hermogenes, who starves to death rather than betray his faith. The problems that initiated it all, chaos, anarchy, a war of all against all, returned on a monstrous scale. And their resolution required not the genius of a Viking manager, but self-sacrifice in the name of an idea born from the ashes of his very own project. The circle closed, but on an entirely new, tragic level. And this brings us to the main, insoluble paradox of the entire narrative, its very core. The relentless drive for absolute order, for total centralization, for the creation of an ideal, unfettered hierarchy of power, inevitably gives rise to the bloodiest and most destructive chaos. The entire developmental logic from Oleg to Ivan the Terrible is the logic of progressive centralization, the suppression of any alternatives, and the concentration of all power in one pair of hands. And this logic reached its zenith in the figure of the Terrible himself, who became the living embodiment of absolute order, where the will of one person was law. Yet it was precisely this system, pushed to its logical extreme, that gave birth to the Oprichnina, the quintessence of lawlessness, and the time of troubles, the apotheosis of anarchy. The very system designed to combat chaos became its primary source. The tighter the screws were turned, the more furiously the threads stripped. This paradox permeates the entirety of Russian history. A thirst for order begets terror. Terror, in turn, breeds fear and apathy. Fear and apathy, at moments when central authority weakens, erupt into rebellion, senseless and merciless. And from the ashes of rebellion, the dream of a firm hand to restore order is born anew. This pulsating rhythm, this eternal oscillation between two poles, rigid dictatorship and all-consuming anarchy, has become a kind of cardiogram for Russian statehood. And each time the system attempted to break free from this cycle, it merely plunged back into it with renewed force. Is this cycle truly fated? Is this the inescapable historical code, that quintessential Russian blueprint from which there is no exit? All of our history, from the Poludia tribute collections to the Oprichnina, from Oleg the Seer to Ivan the Terrible, seems to compel us toward this pessimistic conclusion. It repeatedly shows us how geography, climate, external threats, and internal psychology time and again pushed the country toward choosing centralization and force, even when that force became self-destructive. But history does not provide pre-packaged answers, it merely poses questions. It reveals to us not only the logic of power, but also the logic of resistance. It showcases not only tsars and executioners, but also Novgorodian republicans and Prince Kurbsky and Patriarch Hermogenes, individuals who strove to offer an alternative even at the cost of their own lives. Their defeat does not signify that their path was wrong. It merely signifies that at that particular historical juncture, a different force prevailed. And gazing upon this entire grand, captivating and horrifying panorama, a final pivotal question arises, one for which I will offer you no answer. I will leave it to you so that you, like me, can continue this unending intellectual quest. Is history a spiral where we are condemned to repeat the same fundamental errors on a new technological and social level, time and again tripping over the same old blunders left by our distant forebears? Or does humanity, after all, have a chance, by dissecting its past experiences and comprehending these eternal cycles, to one day find the strength to break free from this rut and forge an entirely new path?